1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. Whereas Paul is giving the qualifications for elders and deacons in the first part of the chapter, the end of the chapter tells us why, in part, that he gave them. Our text reads in verse 14, "These things write I unto thee, hoping to come unto thee shortly. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth." The church, then, Paul has identified it as the pillar and the ground of truth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse 9, Paul tells the Corinthians, he says, "For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry. Ye are God's building, according to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder. I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Paul considered himself to be a master builder, at least in this point in time. And he says, "I've built a foundation and others will build upon it." But the foundation that he built is the truth about Jesus Christ. And so when you're building, we know that, you usually start with the foundation. And Paul says, "I've done that. I've built a foundation as a wise master builder." And the pillars are part of the next part that supports the top of the building. And Paul, as a wise master builder, built the foundation upon Jesus Christ. And we just read those same verses, 1 Corinthians 3, verses 9 through 11. This foundation that Paul built was Jesus Christ. And so Paul isn't saying that he is a master builder of structures, but rather he is using it as a comparison that we would understand, a figure of speech, if you will. And he built the gospel, or he built the foundation upon Jesus Christ by the preaching of God's word. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul writes to the saints of Galatia in verse 8, he says, "But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed." Now for emphasis, verse 9, "As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed." Paul says, I build a foundation, and that foundation is Jesus Christ. And he used the gospel to build that foundation. And then he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I realized when I was preparing the lesson that I've been quoting this verse, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, incorrectly. But if I was still using the American Standard, I'd be okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul says, Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. The American Standard says, Be ye imitators of me, as I am also of Christ. He wants us to follow him in being a master builder, a wise master builder, being a preacher of the gospel, being a teacher of the gospel. He wants us to imitate him to the extent that he follows Christ. We were talking about in our Bible class this morning about false teachers moving in. And Paul would be implying here in his statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that if I quit following Christ, you don't follow me. And Paul gave the Galatians that warning. He says, I don't know what's up with you guys, but if anybody preaches a different gospel, let him be accursed. So it's very important to Paul to live and do as the Word of God says. And as you think back over your reading and studying of the book of Acts and even the Romans and the other epistles, that the question comes to mind, how were they so successful in preaching the gospel? And I'd like to offer from some suggestions as to how or why they were successful and how we can be. And one of those reasons why I think that they were so successful is, as Paul said to the Romans in Romans chapter 1, Romans chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. Paul says, so as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. Now, if we wanted to stop right there, we'd say accurately that Paul was ready always to preach the gospel. And he says, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. But the reason that I think that they were so successful is coupled with the idea that they were ready to preach the gospel. But is the next verse, Paul says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. And such being the case, he was a man of conviction. And that's the next reason that I think that they were successful. The disciples, the the Christians in spreading the gospel in their age, their time, they were not ashamed of the gospel. And this shows us an element of the next reason, that is, of conviction. They were a people of conviction. Someone has said, if you were accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And you know, that's a good question to ask ourselves from time to time. If we were accused of being Christians, would there be enough evidence to convict us? Without a doubt, the Apostle Paul lived what he taught. And we can go into 2 Corinthians and find out all the things that Paul suffered as a Christian, to know that he would be a man of conviction. And the third element in being successful for these people, New Testament Christians, is that of courage. Courage. Courage and conviction go hand in hand, and you almost can't have one without the other. But notice Philippians chapter 1. Paul said in Romans 1 that he was not ashamed of the gospel. In Philippians 1, verse 16 and 17, Paul was talking about, we'll read verse 15 to kind of get us up to speed here. It says, some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. Paul was set for the defense of the gospel. Paul was there, ready, always, to preach the gospel and to assist people in learning the truth. In 1 Peter chapter 3, First Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, he admonishes, Peter does by inspiration, the people that he's writing to, and it says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Be ready always to give an answer. Paul said, I'm ready to preach the gospel to the Romans. Paul, by example, was always ready to preach the gospel whenever the opportunity afforded itself. And it was important enough for the Apostle Paul to request people to pray that God would open the door to him so he could go through it and preach the gospel. Paul was not ashamed. Paul was convinced in the accuracy of the revelation, and his conviction was that he was doing right in sharing the gospel. And he shows, the early disciples show their courage Early in the book of Acts, Peter and the apostles were arrested for preaching the word, and they were beaten and charged not to do it anymore. And what did they do? They counted it joy to suffer because of the cause, and they continued preaching the gospel. They were not hindered by the authorities, even though the authorities tried. What was it Peter told the one man? We must obey God rather than men. That took courage to say it to the face of the authority. It took conviction. And the fourth thing I'd like for us to, what I think is a key component to the success of the early church, is attitude. Attitude is so important. We read a few moments ago Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25 and verse 11. I guess I didn't read that before. We ready? It's new for you. But we want to include it here at any rate. Acts chapter 25 and verse 11. Paul's attitude was, "For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal to Caesar." That's conviction, at least in my mind, to say to the authorities, if I have done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Because I'm ready to accept responsibility for my actions. He was confident enough, his attitude was that his actions were right, and he could say that. But there weren't any charges against him that were worthy of his death. Attitude is so important. Psalmist spent a lot of time talking about attitude. Maybe you know where I'm taking you, because it happens to be a favorite passage of mine. Psalm 119. It's 175 verses long. We're not going to talk about. Is it? Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, it's 176 verses long. We're not going to take time to read it all, but I want us to read beginning verse 97. Psalm 119, verse 97. The psalmist says by inspiration, "Oh, how love I thy law. It is my meditation all the day. Thou through thy commandments hast made me wiser than mine enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for thy testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the ancients, because I keep thy precepts. I have refrained my feet from every evil way, that I might keep thy word. I have not departed from thy judgments, for thou hast taught me. How sweet are the words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. The next verse is probably one of the most known, recognizable verses from this chapter. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. But the whole theme of Psalm 119 is our attitude toward the law of God. And the psalmist said, "Oh, how love I thy law. It is my meditation all the day." His attitude, his focus was upon the will of God. It is important for us to not be ashamed of the gospel, to be a people of courage, a people of conviction, and if you will allow me, people with an attitude. And a lot of times we don't say that in a kind way. But our attitude needs to be, "Oh, how love I thy law." Our attitude needs to be as God would have it to be. Now is the part where I left what I needed at home. But I wanted to share with you, and I think I'll try to get it to Levi, maybe in the bulletin. It was taken from The Spiritual Sword, Volume 42, Number 1, October of 2010. And it's entitled Memories of Joe H. Blue. And it was an autobiographical quote about the life that Joe Blue had lived. And it runs in some ways similar to Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Beginning in verse 20, it says, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, "For ye suffer, if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take you, or take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? Paul says, so am I. Are they Israelites? So am I, he says. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day have I been in the deep. in the journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. And he continues giving a historical picture of his suffering, his attitude, and his thought behind it all. But the memories of Joe H. Blue took place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, here in the States. And it fits real good right here, I think. So I'd like for us to remember three things. The church is a pillar in the ground of truth. And we are those pillars as a part of the church. Secondly, I'd like for us to remember to never underestimate the power of our enemies. And thirdly, let us remember that attitude moves mountains. If you're here this morning and have some need to respond to heaven's invitation, we would encourage you to come and let it be known as together